I'm going to talk about the history of NFTs today. It's, as with any history, it's going to be sort of told from the perspective of the person that's speaking. So you should know that this is sort of how I understand the history of NFTs. I've been lucky enough. I've been in the space for a little bit over 4 years, so I've lived a lot of this history, and you're going to hear sort of my personal account. I think you'll probably be talking to Martin Ostachowski in an upcoming class, and I think Martin has done probably a better job than I have in sort of gathering a comprehensive sort of academic version of the history. But hopefully, sort of my personal view will give you some insights into sort of how NFTs became popular, and some of the different folks within the space, and give you a little bit of my background as well. And then I want to make sure I leave time at the end for questions. I think a lot of times that's where the conversation part is where things kind of get interesting or exciting. So who am I relative to NFTs? Like I said, I got into the space about 4 years ago. I generally introduce myself, when I introduce myself, and say that I grew up in a family of engineers. So my dad was an engineer, my older brother was an engineer, my younger brother was an engineer. And this is important. The reason I share that is because I grew up in a very, very, very technical family where, breakfast, lunch, dinner, vacation, every conversation was about technical things. It's interesting. I'm trying to hire my brother to my company. So I went out for dinner with him last night and my tech co-founder. And I felt like I was flashback to my childhood because they were just talking over my head about technical things for like an hour while we were eating. And so most of my life has been spent listening to very technical people, but all I wanted to do from a very, very young age was be a painter or an artist. My heroes were like, Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock. So I ended up going to art school in the late 90s and studying painting, printmaking, sculpture, art history. And then when I graduated, couldn't find a job and went into the tech space and have spent the last 20 years or so working at tech companies, mostly startups. A few of them got acquired, and I ended up at larger companies. But my passion and goal was to always sort of escape that and get back into art. So from 2007 to 2010, while working at a startup during the days, I went to school nights at Mass Art in a program that I think was really ahead of its time called the Dynamic Media Institute, where I went really, really deep into generative art, the history of generative art, programming generative art myself, and then other things like UX, UI, user experience, data visualization. And that was pretty unique for 2007. So that's where a lot of my passion around digital and generative art came from. I later started a blog on art and tech because I missed, writing about that part of history and felt like really digital artists were being overlooked. So that's artnome.com. And back in 2017, a friend of mine said, you should really look at the blockchain. I think it would align with a lot of things you're interested on the art side. And at first I thought, well, blockchain, that sounds like cryptocurrency, that's about money. That's not like, that sounds like a nerdy thing that's, not really focused to do with art, not anything I'd be interested in. But I took a couple of hours and researched the blockchain and realized that there's a lot of problems in the art world that can be addressed via blockchain. So we'll get into some of those later. Kind of fell into the rabbit hole like a lot of folks do, but I was very early. So I had the opportunity to go to Rare Art Festival 1, which a lot of people describe as like sort of the event where NFTs and the NFT community and crypto art community was sort of born. Prior to that, a lot of people were sort of working on projects individually, so we'll talk about that in a bit. But that put me in contact with a lot of folks that I wanted to interview. So I put out a podcast called the Dank Rares Podcast in early 2018. So long before we called these things NFTs, we called them either crypto art or Dank Rares, and that's where the title came from. I've spent a bunch of time in the last few years trying to contribute to the community, and including green NFTs, which I did earlier this year. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And now launching a company to try to help people protect their NFTs called Club NFT. So I like to sprinkle art throughout my whole presentation. This is one of my favorite physical pieces I have. It was a tribute work that Hackatow made of me in 2019. And it's been a lot of fun to watch artists like Xcopy and Hackatow and Osanachi and folks that I kind of collected early on have now become pretty famous, and their works are selling for lots of money. So I like to start at the very beginning. I don't want to make too many assumptions about what people know and don't know. And I won't get super technical in the presentation, so I keep things kind of at a high level. But often when I describe like what is an NFT, maybe we start there. So NFT stands for non-fungible token. Why that's interesting is because it introduces this idea of digital scarcity into the digital art world, which was sort of lacking that for a while. People found it sort of conceptually difficult to figure out why they would want to collect digital art when they could just see it for free. But folks took this concept early on. A bunch of us looked at Bitcoin and thought, well, if you can have a provably digitally scarce currency, why couldn't we apply that same thinking to artwork? Also comes with immutable provenance, which means you can kind of prove who owns it, because these tokens are distributed across a bunch of different computers, which makes it difficult for anyone to kind of come in and change the information. And then we have smart contracts associated with that. We'll talk about all of that in a little bit. So Bitcoin Genesis block is around 2009. So this whole space is still fairly young. And Bitcoin is a decentralized digital currency that was invented by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is actually, it's a pseudonym, and people actually don't know who Satoshi is, whether it's he or she is. But it was based on this principle of decentralization and peer-to-peer sharing. So sort of the spirit of the community was, let's not depend on third-party intermediaries anymore, like banks. Let's find a way that we can actually be our own banks and have our own control over our own security without having to trust anyone in a decentralized manner, and to be able to pass back and forth payments. And that spirit and philosophy sort of carries over into the early crypto art, and we see it less so maybe now with NFTs as they're becoming more and more popular. But I think it's important to know that sort of the philosophy, culture, and spirit of cryptocurrency plays an important role early on in crypto art. So this work is by Xcopy, and I should say this work is one by Sarah Zucker from my collection. Again, I just like to put art in throughout the slides. So early experiments with art on the blockchain are really just these early cryptocurrency enthusiasts are trying to explore what are things that we could do to actually put the art literally on the blockchain. And one thing that people don't always realize is that the blockchain is actually not great for storage. So the blockchain is essentially a database. But as a database, it has a lot of strengths, and but a weakness is that it's actually not good for storing large files. So a lot of these NFTs, the majority of the NFTs that are out there, it's actually the token is on the blockchain, which is sort of the code or the agreement for the transaction. But that token typically has what they call a hash or a link that points out to somewhere else where the actual files live. And those files normally would live, sort of the standard is on something called IPFS. People might have heard of that. It stands for Interplanetary Files System, and so kind of a funny name. But in the early days, people were experimenting with, given the limited sort of storage efficiency of blockchain, how could we figure out how to put images directly on the blockchain? So this is a tribute to cryptographer Len Sassaman, who passed away, that was made in 2011, where Dan Kaminsky actually encoded using ASCII art, a series of just symbols, numbers, and letters to put the portrait directly onto the blockchain. And there's some debate about who created the first NFT. I actually don't get that excited about, who was exactly first. I think there are a lot of different people that made contributions. And the earliest versions of NFTs were all, sort of variations. It would be hard to say that any of these things were the exact sort of format of an NFT that we see today. So when people get kind of crazy over who was first, I call that firstism. I'm like, I'm not really that into firstism. We see it even now. Every week or every day now with NFTs, people are like, it's the first this NFT or the first that NFT, and like, I don't know. I'm not that hung up on which one was exactly first, but we know some of the earliest ones. So this is, I think it's called Quantum by Kevin McCoy and Anil Dash in 2014. They actually came out and did some press around under the name of Monograph and monograph.com. And we're talking about a lot of the concepts that have come to today that we now know as NFTs. So 2014 is an important year. We tend to see interest in NFTs and art on the blockchain go up and down, corresponding with how well the crypto markets are. So, you know, the part of the reason we saw an explosion in interest in NFTs in late 2020, early 2021, is because Bitcoin and Ethereum were going up so high. We saw the same thing happen in 2017, early 2018, and then by mid 2018, when crypto markets kind of cooled off, we saw sort of a lot of the marketplaces go out of business and you know, a loss of interest. Another important early artist, Rhea Myers, kind of made the argument that the contracts themselves were the artwork. So this is Ethereum, this contract is art. So again, sort of not the standard NFT as we know it today, but very early to kind of point out that the contracts themselves can be sort of a form of conceptual art. And Rhea, you know, continues to today and has a really healthy artistic practice and is a really important contributor to the sort of entire history of art in the blockchain. So someone to check out if you don't know her work. Nilly coins. So Nilly Learner, actually until pretty recently, was kind of left out of the history, which a lot of us thought was unfortunate, and we've all kind of tried to work to make sure that she gets the credit that she's due. So she actually launched what I think are the closest things to early NFTs. Also in 2014, they were works that were sort of meant to be like memes around these large corporate brands. And she describes pretty well on this Bitcoin forum in 2014 what her objectives are, and they sound like NFTs to me. But back then, even the diehard cryptocurrency people, when they heard about this concept of what an NFT could be from Nilly back in 2014, they thought it was a scam. So you hear today people that first hear about NFTs that don't really understand it. They'll say, oh, this is a scam or a pyramid scheme or whatever. But usually you don't hear that from the cryptocurrency folks because they tend to understand. But poor Nilly back in 2014, she was so far ahead of her time that even the cryptocurrency people were kind of saying, oh, this is a scam, because they just couldn't figure it out. But what she was doing back then is almost exactly what we've come to know as NFTs today. So those were sort of individuals that were working on individual projects, and you know, it would be really hard to say that there was a movement back then. There probably wasn't really all that much interest in you know, globally in any one of those artists or projects at the time. Of course, you know, we now understand how important the work was that they were doing. But it wasn't until 2016, actually during sort of the down market, when Joe Looney created Rare Pepe Wallet, that we start to see communities develop around this idea of digital collectibles and NFTs. So Rare Pepe can sometimes be a difficult topic to explain to people, particularly people from the US, because during the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the alt-right and sort of neo-Nazi groups co-opted Pepe the Frog, and it became sort of a hate symbol. But this group that created sort of Rare Pepe Wallet, which is the first NFT marketplace, was focused on Pepe the Frog as a meme, an online meme, long before it became co-opted as a hate symbol. So they don't really have anything to do with that negative history of Pepe as a hate symbol. But unfortunately, they're often left out of the history, or they used to be left out of the history. That's getting corrected this year. But like all last year, people would act like, you know, CryptoPunks was the beginning of NFTs, and they kind of completely ignore this because they were, you know, sort of lazy journalism, I would say. They didn't want to have to explain. It's already hard to explain what the heck an NFT is, but then to try to explain why, you know, Pepe the Frog is okay in this instance, I think was a heavy load for a lot of journalists. But we're starting to see that turnaround. They're selling a Rare Pepe at Sotheby's soon, which I think shows that people are kind of becoming more comfortable with its role. So Joe's Rare Pepe wallet is basically, if you think about Super Rare or Known Origin or any of these marketplaces, all of them are heavily based on Rare Pepe wallet. Almost all aspects of how they function and what they do, and this idea that people can contribute digital artworks and buy, sell, trade them on-chain or content like bonus content tied to NFTs, all kinds of stuff. So there's a really, I'd encourage you to watch a really cool video from early 2018 where Joe Looney gives a demo at the Rare Art Festival. And he basically, people give me credit for sort of seeing the future in this space, but Joe basically invented the future. Like, there's still things in Rare Pepe wallet that other marketplaces haven't caught up with. Then 2017, we see a lot of people assume that Ethereum was where NFTs were born because it's a very popular, probably the most popular chain for NFTs. But we don't see NFTs come to Ethereum until 2017 with Curio Cards by Travis Uhrig, who, again, it's sort of the similar theme where artists can put their work on. And actually, with both Rare Pepe wallet and Curio Cards, they were taking no commission originally. And it was really this idea that just like cryptocurrency wanted to remove the banks, in the early days, they wanted to remove the gallerists and the gallery fees so that the artists could take 100% commission. But that's evolved, and now that these newer marketplaces require a lot of effort and upkeep and market the artists, they now take a cut, but usually a cut that's much lower than traditional galleries. Also in 2017, right around the exact time that Curio Cards came out, CryptoPunks was launched, probably the best known NFT project. So Matt Hall and John Watkinson, two good friends of mine, put out 10,000 of these, and it's hard for people to really wrap their heads around it because they've become so popular. But at the time, nobody really even knew what these things were. There wasn't a lot of precedent, and they gave them away, and they didn't necessarily get snatched up right away. They now sell for, I think the cheapest you can get a CryptoPunk for is about $300,000. I like this project, and I think it's really important for our space. I think of this as a generative art project. So they programmed all these different combinations of traits that were then sort of the program itself sort of created all 10,000 of the works versus sort of hand creating them with pixels. So it's generative art, but because they're cute and they're actually sort of portraits and approachable, it's almost like a Trojan horse where people couldn't really understand NFTs and blockchain and didn't really understand generative art, but yet they love CryptoPunks, and it's a good way to start that conversation because I think it checks both of those boxes. Also in 2017, Data NYC, which was a global drawing program started by Bea Ramos, Judy Mam, and Abraham Alano. It had been around for several years, and it's this beautiful online space where their premise was people from all around the world should be able to communicate through drawing for free. So you would sign in and make a drawing, and someone would extend that drawing from another part in the world, and you didn't have to speak the same language verbally, because the idea is all artists can kind of connect sort of visually. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I just saw that note pop up in the upper right. And they were looking at trying to build an entirely new economy, still are, for artists, and identified very early on, one of the first projects to identify the potential for the blockchain, and have sort of integrated that very thoughtfully into their platform over the last few years. And then maybe arguably the first commercial NFT platform would be Rare Art Labs in late 2017. So if you think about Rare Pepe or Curio Cards, Dada or CryptoPunks, those were all either like personal projects or sort of community projects and done for free. And Rare is sort of like the predecessor to say like Super Rare or Known Origin, where those are all great guys, but they run more like a company, although Super Rare recently kind of gave out their governance token to give back control to the community a little bit. And Rare is important, as we'll see, because they actually helped organize the Rare Arts Festival and also contributed a lot early on. They're no longer with us. They went out of business in 2018 when the markets crashed a little bit, but they're an important player early on, in my opinion. So that's when I come in. I actually, those early years from 2009 to 2017, I wasn't really active in the space until late 2017, and that's when I went and did a few hours research. I wrote an article that was called "The Blockchain Art Market is Here." So kind of an audacious title for someone that had only done a few hours of research on the blockchain, but I could kind of see right away how the blockchain matched up with a lot of problems that I had seen in the art world. So in that article, I call out 4 opportunities where I thought the blockchain could really help in the art world. The first was to drive digital art sales through digital scarcity. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but there really wasn't much of a market for digital art, up to until very recently, arguably, right? People weren't, when I would go to art events, people didn't even talk about digital art, and they didn't think of it as something that they wanted to collect or own. But I saw the potential in late 2017 for blockchain to kind of bring this sense of scarcity to digital art, which would maybe increase the desire to collect it, similar to how Bitcoin was sort of provably rare on the currency side. Democratizing fine art as an investment. So most of us can't afford to spend $100,000 on a Picasso, but we used to think about this idea of tokenizing real works or even fractionalizing digital works. And when you do that, these more famous, expensive works can be broken up almost into like shares of stock, where you can break them into smaller pieces where people can afford them. Improving provenance and reducing art forgery. So a big part of my focus, we don't talk about it as much in this presentation, but a big part of my focus in the last 10 years or so has been fighting forgery and thinking through ways to improve provenance for the more traditional art world. And it was clear to me that having an immutable record, so a distributed record of who created what, who bought what, that whole record on the blockchain is pretty much impossible to go back in and change. That's what immutable means. So it gives us a really strong sense of which works are authentic, which ones are forged, and it sort of traces the path of where they've gone over their lifespan. And then a more ethical way of paying artists. As a failed artist myself, I've always been interested in experimenting with and investing in new systems that support a broader range of artists, and the smart contracts that are associated with the blockchain allow us to bake in royalties. There's still work to be done there to make sure that the royalties are honored across all platforms. But this idea that as an artist, what if you sell a work to somebody for a small amount of money and then they go on and sell it for a lot of money? Traditionally, you don't always get to see any of that value come back to you. And there's potential to bake that into smart contracts with NFTs and the blockchain. So after I wrote that article, the next day I woke up and I had literally like 100 emails from people all around the world because there was so much interest in art and blockchain and no one was really writing about it, and I had good SEO. And everyone from Christie's to the Princess of Bahrain asked if I could come and speak at different events, but I wasn't really an expert. I had just done a few hours worth of research. So I thought, well, I better actually go and learn something about this space. And that's when I saw an advertisement for Rare AF1 in New York City in early 2018. So I went to Rare AF1 and I met Matt and John, the CryptoPunks, and Bea from Datanyc, and Joe Looney, the creator of Rare Pepe Wallet, and became very, very close friends with all of these people early on before they were sort of famous as they've sort of become today. And those people, as well as everyone else in the community, were just incredibly, incredibly generous with their time and let me interview all of them and answered all my questions for months and months. And that's why I do things like what I'm doing today and donate my time and spend as much time as I can trying to answer other people's questions, because that's how we keep the spirit of crypto art and NFTs positive and moving in the right direction. So coming out of that conference in early 2018, people were calling this crypto art, but no one had really tried to define what crypto art actually was. And as someone who wrote about art and tech, I thought it was important to try to give it a shot. So for a while, I would say through 2018 and 2019, if you looked up anything to do with crypto art or blockchain in art, because we weren't talking about NFTs yet, my articles were sort of the first things that came up on Google. But at a high level, in trying to define early stages of crypto art, I basically said, these are, I think, the things that while it's all a little bit different, these are the things that I think it has in common. So digitally native, meaning that most of the work at the time was sort of being created initially digitally. Geographically agnostic, so a lot of historical art movements come from one particular part of the world, but this one is sort of unique in that it came from all parts of the world. It kind of emerged in all different areas. Democratic and permissionless, unlike the old art world where it's all about who you know and having to get like the right introductions or having a museum accept your work. Especially in the early days of crypto art, everyone was free to participate, and it didn't matter what your gender, was, or race, or color, or religious beliefs, or geography. Everybody was welcome. Decentralized, so basically there wasn't a single gatekeeper who decided what got in and what didn't get in. Anonymous, many of the artists chose and still do choose to not use their real names, which often frees them up to be more experimental with their work. Mimetic, so in the early days, crypto art was largely focused around memes. You think about Rare Pepe and things like that, and the idea was, how do we make these digital, images or artworks that can travel really quickly? Self-referential. A lot of times, the early crypto art was about actual crypto history and cryptocurrencies, things like that. Crypto patrons. So early on, I figured out that the bulk of the collectors, and there weren't that many early on, but this has kind of stayed true, were people that had done pretty well in the cryptocurrency markets, because there aren't that many things you can buy directly with cryptocurrency, so art's pretty appealing. Pro artists, so those early movements were not even taking commissions, and we're really just trying to figure out a better way for artists to make a living in the space, and that's something that a lot of us that have been in this for a long time are hoping stays as part of NFTs as they become popular. And then this thing I call dankness, which basically said in the old art world, you got popular if your work was quote unquote really like skilled or good. But in a crypto art world where everyone is welcome to participate, rather than judging people on traditional things like how much art education they have or how realistic their works are, it's more just about how expressive they are, and that kind of lowers the bar so that everybody can participate, not just professionally trained artists. So later on in 2018, we started to see new, more professional marketplaces launch. Super Rare came out, and I had been part of their beta and had seen this work by artist Robbie Barrett. That was some of the early GAN-based art, and it really blew my mind, and I loved it as someone who loves digital art. But there weren't a lot of great ways before NFTs to collect digital art. So I actually went to Super Rare before they launched and said, hey, I really want to collect this work by Robbie Barrett. Can I be, essentially your first customer? And at the time, Super Rare is very well known now, and artists kind of, fight to try to get on there. At the time, nobody had any idea what Super Rare was. So I was actually arguably taking a risk, right, by being the first customer there and trying to introduce Robbie to them. But I became Super Rare's first customer, brought them Robbie Barrett, Hackatow. I think by then they might have known Xcopy, but was collecting with Xcopy. And it just, back then, it was such a different, smaller space. There weren't really a bunch of collectors like there are now trying to compete to get these things. It was really all just kind of an experiment. And we felt like we had to help educate the world on, like why this stuff was important and like how it worked. So I was invited to speak at Christie's in London and talk about the blockchain and art. And really that conference was more about how to use the blockchain to track traditional physical artworks. But I wanted to go and talk about digital artwork. So I asked Super Rare, hey, can we work together to find a way to give out an artwork to everyone at this conference? So we came up with this idea of using what's called a paper wallet. This is actually a plastic card, but the concept is called a paper wallet. And it's a way to put an NFT on a physical card so that you can give it away. So we gave away, or I gave away 300 NFTs by Robbie Barrett from the stage at Christie's in London in 2018. And I have to tell you, the crowd had no idea what the heck I was talking about and almost no interest. There just wasn't a lot of interest. Even though this is only a few years ago, there was not a lot of interest in the traditional art world and digital art. So they were kind of like yawning and stuff, falling asleep when I was telling them. Look, basically I said, look, this is digital art. You have one for free in your goodie bag. do not throw this away. I will buy this off of you. This is an important artist. People are going to collect this way in the future, right? So we gave away 300, and now 3 years, 4 years later, I believe 270 of them are unaccounted for, and the ones that are located sell for about $1 million now. So they're called the Lost Robbies. People in the NFT space, they're kind of famous now because people go on hunts to try to find the ones that are missing. So this is a screenshot from the stage when we were talking about that. But at the time, this was the other panel that I moderated, and it was much more focused on sort of provenance for traditional painting. And really, people weren't even hip yet on what was going on with digital art. So I then kind of like to talk about the next few years at a high level, what challenges were. Again, NFTs have become so big, people have a hard time realizing that almost nobody was interested in this stuff, as recently as 2 or 3 years ago. But that first year was about how do we get artists to even participate? So like, Super Rare doesn't come from a background, the founders are awesome guys, but they don't come from a background around art. So they were reaching out to folks like me and saying like, how do we find artists, right? And I was trying to make introductions, and there were a bunch of other platforms that were literally struggling to find artists because artists didn't understand what they were trying to do yet, right? So the first year, the question was, how do we get artists onto these platforms? The second year, at Rare AF2, a lot of what we focused on was, okay, now we have artists, how do we get collectors to care, right? Because we had all this artwork on these platforms that was just sitting there. Of course, that artwork now is worth tons of money and people will fight for it. But just a few years ago, nobody really cared. So we tried to spend more and more time getting collectors interested, and there are a handful of fairly wealthy collectors that people referred to as whales that kind of came in around late 2019, 2020, who were really important because if no one's collecting, this whole process or system doesn't work. And then we had sort of people from the traditional art world who were trying to write this whole thing off for years and years. They're embracing it now, but don't let them fool you. The Christie's and Sotheby's type folks of the world had zero interest in this when we were kind of building the foundation of it. And one of the things that I would get from the traditional art world is they would say, oh, well, what you're building is cute, but you don't have a secondary market, so it doesn't really matter yet. Like, anyone can buy something once, but it's only when it sells a second time that, you can prove out a viable market. So it was around 2020 that I started letting some of the early work that I owned as a collector go because I was getting, some pretty aggressive offers, $10,000, $15,000, which people thought was absolutely crazy. The idea that someone would buy a work, on the secondary market from me for $10,000, like I think I sold the first Super Rare token for $10,000, people thought that was totally nuts. How would anyone ever spend $10,000 on an NFT? Well, now we know that happens every day, all the time, right? In fact, earlier this year, Beeple sold a work for $70 million, and that's kind of when the traditional art collectors and the press and all these other people started coming in. And I kind of have mixed feelings about this. I think Beeple's a great artist. I have a lot of respect for him. He puts in work every single day, sort of famously. But in terms of what this did, it brought a lot of attention to our space, our small little NFT space. But at the same time, because the attention came in over this giant sale, it switched the conversation from being about how do we make a better system for artists to how do we all make a lot of money, right? The conversation just changed really quickly. So collectors wanted to come in to try to make money fast. Artists wanted to come in to make money fast. And those first 3-4 years, there was no money to be made. So everyone that was in this space was in it like authentically just to try to experiment and make a better system. And I know we still have lots of people that are still trying to do that. But this on the positive side, this helped grow our space really quickly. On the perhaps negative side, in some senses, it also it made it very commercial very quickly. So after sort of the Beeple sale, things accelerated really quickly. We started seeing venture capitalists like Mark Cuban and investing companies like Lazy.com and other giant sales coming through. I think it was something like $3 billion in the first half of 2021 in sales. OpenSea did $1 billion in sales in August alone. So things just heated up really, really quickly. And toward the beginning of the year, as people started paying more attention to NFTs, there became more and more focus on the ecological concerns and about how the blockchain isn't necessarily all that good for the environment, particularly blockchains that use proof of work, like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Ethereum's plan is to move to proof of stake, but today they're on a proof of work blockchain, which requires a bunch of computers all around the world to sort of compete to solve a problem in order to mine the next block. So Memo Aitken, a fairly well-known digital artist, actually wrote an important piece sort of challenging people, saying like, look, these NFTs are actually really bad for the environment and we need to be thoughtful about this, which was important, and I'm glad that he did that. But then it kind of devolved to where environmentalists were like, giving death threats literally to some of the artists and saying like, you have to, villainizing them, you have to stop making these NFTs and you're destroying the planet. And it just wasn't productive. Like I consider myself an environmentalist, but I also love NFTs. And I knew a lot of these artists that were getting these threats or just a lot of hatred. They were like, artists from around the world in places that maybe didn't have strong economies who were feeding their families. And these aren't artists necessarily that had big carbon footprints. They maybe never have flown anywhere, didn't own a car. So I just wanted to find a way to diffuse the situation. So I started the Green NFTs initiative back in February and raised from the community, who are amazing community. We raised $100,000 and had a hackathon with about 50 teams competing to try to figure out ways to improve the efficiency around NFTs so that they were less energy consuming, but also to help educate artists and collectors, because there were a lot of smart people back then saying things that seemed contradictory. And I didn't want to see this whole movement get crushed based on the environmental concerns. I'd rather see it get improved, but I also care about the environment. So, yeah, we had the hackathon, and part of what happened around that time is there was the launch of Datanyc, or HEN. So HEN is based on Tezos. Tezos is a proof-of-stake blockchain, and proof-of-stake is just like borderline infinitely better for the environment when it comes to electrical consumption. And a lot of these artists who I've respected and loved for decades actually now, who were hesitant first to do NFTs back 3 or 4 years ago because ICOs and crypto had a bad name. And then second, because of all these environmental issues that cropped up toward the end of 2020, early 2021, they felt much better about coming in to a platform like Datanyc. So artists like Mario Klingemann kind of helped lead the way, and Joanie Lemercier, and eventually Manolo came over, and so that became where I spent the majority of my time as a collector collecting for this year is over on Datanyc. But I still periodically do purchase works on Ethereum, and I'm eager to see Ethereum move all the way to proof of stake. So then we get to the beginning of the summer, and we start to read all these headlines about, NFTs are dead, NFTs are dying, it's a bubble. We see this pretty much every few months for like the last 4 years. I think this sort of hatred of NFTs comes from people not really understanding them. We see this like when personal computers came out in the early 80s, newspaper writers would write about how computers were going to destroy the world and break kids' brains and all this like crazy stuff. And it's just people fear things when they're new and they don't understand them. We saw the same thing with video games and with social media and with the internet. So I think we're still pretty early, and it's going to be a while before the mainstream public actually understands fully what NFTs are and what they can be. But obviously NFTs are not dead based on the sales. We saw 10 billion in sales in Q3 alone. So this is a fairly recent report, numbers that came out. But we will see peaks and valleys. We know we see peaks and valleys. We saw a lot of interest in late 2017, 2018, and then we saw a crash. And then we'll probably see a crash again, later on. But this is my very scientific graph that I put out a few months ago. And what I'm pointing out is that you shouldn't be afraid of the crash. Actually, the most interesting projects usually happens when cryptocurrency crashes. So Rare Pepe and CryptoPunks, those were projects that people were doing out of boredom because the cryptocurrencies were low and they wanted to know, well, what else can we do in sort of the crypto space? And similarly, Rarible, Super Rare, Known Origin, a lot of those platforms sort of got their start in a lower period, which gave them time to build a community and actually do something authentic instead of just chasing dollars, right? And along the way, even though we see these sort of peaks and valleys, with each peak and valley we actually see the core community grow, and I think that's what's important. Let's see. So I think this is sort of me, a tweet that sort of summarizes my position on why I think NFTs are important and going to continue to grow. So I wrote, our generation's culture is largely digital. NFTs let us preserve and collect that history the way previous generations did with analog history. It sometimes looks clunky because the solutions aren't perfect and we are in a transitional period, but the train has left the station. So this is just to say I'm very bullish on this. Like, the most important things that have happened in our lifetimes have happened through sort of intermediated through media and digital media. And if we're not careful and we don't preserve those things, they'll disappear. We've seen it with a lot of like flash-based artwork and advertising and cartoons. Like, you know, our world was sort of governed by that, and Flash has disappeared, and a lot of that work is disappearing. So we need to do things like use NFTs to try to actually protect the culture of our time. So just a few more quick slides. I like to leave everybody, you know, I get a lot of questions from people about, you know, they want advice on how to get into the NFT space. And I often tell them it's maybe counterintuitive, but instead of coming in and asking, how do I make money or how do I extract value from the NFT space, come in and ask what you can contribute. It turns out that's the fastest way to move up in this community, is actually to, instead of coming in and being like, buy my stuff, buy my stuff, buy my stuff, like we see on Twitter all the time, come in and find a way to help out, you know, promote other artists' work. So I quote John F. Kennedy, I call it Crypto John F. Kennedy, and say, ask not what crypto art can do for you, but what you can do for crypto art. It's really the artists that have been participating in adding value and not begging people to buy their work who have really done well over the last 4 years. So I think there's a lot to learn from that. And it takes a lot of patience and humility. You know, none of the artists I know just made an NFT and then magically became millionaires overnight. You know, and that's not necessarily the goal, nor should it be, of every artist. Really, the goal should be, how do I become a meaningful part of this community? And I think people look at artists like Xcopy or Sarah Zucker, and they think, well, that could never be me, or like, you know, they must have just always been famous, or, you know, I think Snoop Dogg bought an Xcopy work for like $4 million recently, and people are like, well, Xcopy must just have always been famous. So that's why I share this slide. You should know, I bought Xcopy's first NFT, and I paid $1 for it, and it was only 3 or 4 years ago, right? So it's because he was, you know, consistently working really, really hard and putting out work and becoming part of the community that he went from selling work for $1 to me to $4 million to Snoop Dogg. And similarly, Sarah Zucker, who's become, you know, pretty famous and well known now, her work sat on Super Rare unsold for like a year. And I always loved it. So when I finally, you know, sold some of my earlier work and had some money, I went and bought it up and told everybody, you know, you're nuts. Like, this work's great. And now, you know, I can't even afford her work anymore. But my point is, that work was always the same work. Like, it was sitting there and no one wanted it. And now, because it started to sell for more, other people are coming in. So it takes patience. If she had stopped working because it wasn't selling, you know, she would never be where she is today. So I would just say patience and humility are an important part of this. And then the last part I'd say is hard work and abundance. So a lot of times collectors or galleries will tell artists like, oh, you don't flood your market, don't make too much work, don't put too much more work on the market or whatever. And I think that's ridiculous. I actually think it's a sin. The worst thing you can do is to tell an artist to make less work. You know, it's like telling a fish not to swim. The only way you get better as an artist is to make more work, and the only way you get exposure and get people to actually notice and like your work is to put more work out there. So, you know, please ignore the people that are telling you, like, you know, don't make more work, it's going to drive down the value of the works I collected. Make as much work as you can, as often as you can, and share it with as many people as you can, would sort of be my final advice. I have no idea how long I went on this. Hopefully not too long. I'm going to stop sharing and then try to answer questions.
This was awesome. And you didn't, it's just an hour, really, so perfect.
Great. So we have some time for questions, Nicole?
Yeah, we do, definitely. Anyone who wants to ask questions or comments as well, feel free to unmute, or I can also check the I'm on the text channel as well, so I can read out any questions too.
I was very impressed by your presentation. I really want to thank you. This was really amazing how well you understand and how thoughtfully you're explaining us the story of NFT. I mean, it's. I just want to say thank you. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Was that Pierre?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. I appreciate that.
Gosh,
Yes.
same.
Yeah.
I'm kind of speechless here. I'm so glad to listen your presentation, which was awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. And that's it.
Thank you for the feedback.
Yes. I thought it was really awesome as well. And I was actually thinking so much about, not like, since we were since you were talking about like NFT like history and the way it's like became what it is today. And like especially the part about like the rare Pepe wallet. Like it's so interesting for me to see like how this sort of like image appropriation culture has like come from such depths of the internet, and then now like here we are, like I remember, like, because Pepe was created by this like, I don't know, this like comic book artist Matt Furry, like, who wasn't even like that much into like internet culture, and then like, I don't know, image boards took Pepe as a character and just like made it into this like image structure where everyone would just use the same symbol to create their own version of it. And I think like that's, to me, I see like that's one of the beginning points also of like people wanting to kind of like give value to JPEGs as something they would collect. So like you would use a rare Pepe in an image board as a way to show like, I have this way of answering like what you said with this image. And it's like, it's so cool to see that it became rare Pepe wallet, and then it contributed to like other marketplaces in NFT. It's so crazy to think about that.
Yeah, like where it started. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that they were rare was like a joke, right? Because how could something
Yeah.
digital be? And like it literally started from the idea of things that are digital cannot be rare, so calling it rare was a joke. And then we found a way to make things rare, largely because of that meme, right? And then the
Yeah,
beauty,
exactly.
the beauty of it is people didn't really know how Matt Furry felt about NFTs and Rare Pepe Wallet for a long time, and only maybe 3 or 4 months ago, I think he might have sent out a DMCA to one of the projects. I might not even have that acronym right, but basically a legal takedown notice. But
Yeah.
he's come around, and so Joe Looney, who created Rare Pepe Wallet, doesn't live that far from me, and we go hang out and disc golf all the time. So he's a good friend, and I think he was a little nervous about it. But Matt, they've always reserved a card. So they shut down the submissions for Rare Pepe Wallet in 2018, but they saved one card in case Matt Furry ever wanted to do it. So Joe and Matt talked, I guess, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and Matt was into it and actually just made the artwork for the final official Rare Pepe card for Rare Pepe Wallet, and it's by Matt Furry. So it's kind of like a beautiful ending, right? So Pepe's been through so much, and like with the hate symbol thing, and then later was adopted by the Hong Kong protests. So he just means different things to different people all around the world. But you're absolutely right. It was a joke, this idea that there could be a meme marketplace or a meme economy. It was actually a meme that was a meme itself, right? The idea of a meme economy. But that's what we have now. So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, in a way, I was just thinking also about like how this sort of like practice of like giving a sort of value to images, even though like back then there weren't even like any crypto value directly attached to it. But it's just that like I remember so much that like images really had some kind of weight as a collectible if you were like using them, and like whatever image boards, because you always had to use an image to answer to some affirmation question, or even if you wanted to say something, and that rightful image that you was gonna use would just like count so much to the whole thread. And it's just crazy to think that how things just expand, and now like there's just cryptocurrency attached to it. And I don't know, I love this presentation because it reminded me sort of like my adolescence when I was browsing internet and I knew all these symbols. They were like in the depths of my head, and now they mean so many different things. It's crazy.
Yeah, no, those are great insights. I feel very much the same way.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, man, salute to Artnome for that presentation. Like, I love how you put everything in perspective, a lot of knowledge and history, and I'm just glad to be, for you to be a part of this and really be an OG in this space to, inform us on everything.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and so all the love and respect to Nicole for organizing these things. As NFTs get bigger and bigger and bigger, I see a lot of the community stuff that I love that I came into this for 4 years ago starts to disappear or get watered down. So it's it's Nicole who deserves all the credit, and I'm just flattered and grateful that I have the opportunity to meet all the up-and-coming artists through this residency that she put so much work into. So thank you for the compliment, and but all credit due to Nicole.
Yeah. I would say much respect, Miko. Like, I'm glad to be here. Yeah, appreciate you as well.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question. I don't want to. I take this opportunity as well to ask my questions to Jason, who we only speak not as much as we used to because everybody's so busy. But I wanted to ask you something regarding generative art. So obviously now it's kind of like a new trend, right? Like everybody wants to learn about generative art. Everybody wants to be a generative artist because potentially it's obviously like a very interesting thing. It fits the medium very well. And also it seems to get a lot of interest from collectors and the space. Like, what is maybe an advice or a thought that you have for artists who are interested in this medium and who are working towards working towards this practice, essentially?
Yeah. So the history of generative art is sort of my area of passion and expertise in curating generative artists. And it's funny to me to watch. I'll share a quick story and then I'll answer your question. It's been funny to me to watch people explode in interest around generative art and NFTs at the same time this year, because those things were just really nerdy things that only me and a few people cared about just a few years ago. So when I talk to people, I say it's almost like if your hobbies were like, snail racing and I don't know, something equally absurd that like no one cared about, right? And then you wake up one day and literally the entire world is like, I love snail racing. Snail racing's amazing. Like, snail racing's the best thing ever. So it's just such this weird, obscure thing that I've been passionate about for like, literally like 30 years or whatever. And it's been interesting and bizarre at the same time, I have to be honest, to see the level at which everyone sort of seems to have discovered it all at the same time. So I think the reason why that's weird helps me answer your question, which is that through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, generative art was something that only really nerdy computer programmers would engage in, especially in the 60s and the 70s. People didn't even have access. Only very few people had access to computers, and they were the size of a room, and you had to wait in line to get them. And you would write your code, but you couldn't even see what the code looked like until you printed it out on a plotter, right? So by necessity, there was like a very, very, very small number of generative artists through like the 60s, 70s, 80s. We get the personal computer, and there are slightly more people. But again, it tends to be people that have classical training in computer science as opposed to people that have classical training in art. And then in the 90s with Director and Flash, it becomes a little bit more accessible to people. So people like me got their start using like ActionScript in the late 90s. But really the explosion in the number of people that could create generative art happens in the early 2000s with processing. So processing is a language for programming that's really tailored to visual artists and the way visual artists think. It was created by Casey Reese and Ben Fry, two students from the MIT Media Lab. Casey's a really good friend of mine and an amazing generative artist. Ben as well. And it's only because of programs like processing that people like myself and many others, some of these best known generative artists, people like Manolo, Jared Tarbell, a lot of them got their start or really kind of found their way and their passion through processing. And processing, much like the early NFT community, has a really strong community, and it's about like sharing knowledge and sharing code and helping people learn and answering questions on message boards. There's a guy who is I would consider sort of a generative art saint, if there were such a thing, named Daniel Schiffman, who puts out YouTube videos that take people from absolute beginner all the way to like really fairly advanced coding using processing and a few other visual kind of programming languages. So my answer is I would encourage folks to actually get active with trying to learn processing. Start at the earliest tutorials. Join the processing community and the messaging boards. Check out Daniel Schiffman's videos. I can think of like no better way. I mean, that's not the only tool for doing generative art, obviously, but if you're going from like zero knowledge of programming and you want to learn how to bring some programming into your practice, within a day or two you can start getting some pretty cool stuff moving around the screen, and it helps you even in appreciating generative art. Like people that sometimes collectors, I encourage them to learn processing just a little bit, just a few hours worth, because you can really appreciate generative art much more when you have some understanding of the basic process, of programming and how functions work and how variables work and loops work and things like that. So you don't have to become a full-blown computer scientist, but the same way learning about art history or how painting works can help you understand traditional art and art media. I really strongly encourage people to kind of become code literate and just learn a little bit, and processing such a great way to start. So a kind of a long answer, but hopefully that helps.
Definitely.
Hey, I want to know if you could repeat the name again.
Yeah.
I shared it in the chat as well. It's Daniel Schiffman, right, Jason?
Yep, Daniel Schiffman. It's like the coding train. So he's just like this super, happy, cheery dude who, is just like always super positive and high energy. And he walks through from like the very beginning steps of like how to set up the basic program to, to really advanced stuff that's far beyond what I could ever do. And I think, sometimes people wonder. Most people know me as a collector, which feels weird because, I've identified as an artist my whole life. I just haven't had a lot of time to make art in the last few years. But a lot of people ask me as a collector, like, well, how do you know which things to collect? Because it seems like you're always like, months or years ahead of everybody. And really the answer is just because I understand the tools and the history and the process, right? So, it's good for you as an artist, but also if a lot of the artists I know are also collectors, if you collect, learning a little bit more about how the tools work and how processing works just really enhances your appreciation of generative art and helps you find work that's truly remarkable because you kind of know what goes into it a little bit more. So great question, Mikol.
Can I ask a quick question also on the same train as Mikol?
Sure.
Also to do with generative art.
Sure.
So like to me, I feel like also like the introduction of more visual elements to the programming part of generative art is also really interesting to me. Also, comparing to, let's say, music production, when music production softwares were like way less visual, and then like Ableton Live came through, and like to me, for example, it was a much easier tool to like get involved with. So I've never been into code. Like I know very little about how code works and even processing. I'm just starting to actually get to be like code literate, like you said. But I feel like programs also like Touch Designer gives just this visual element to the matrix, which is so interesting as well to me, to just like alter little things and have big results, or just big differences between one and the other number or one and the other parameter. So it's like really fun as well.
Yeah, so I kind of left that part out. Sorry, my dog's going a little bit ballistic at the moment. But it's not like I made some magical jump from not being able to code at all to code. I used a similar approach to what you described, and it's why I'm so sad that Flash is gone. Because Flash in the late 90s was almost like what you described with Ableton, where there was still an interface, and you could click on, like, you could draw an object, click on it, and then right-click and say, like, okay, with, like, the most basic code, you're still in an interface, you can still see things, you can move it around, it feels like Photoshop or something like that, and you can click on these tangible visual things that you created, and then give them characteristics. Like, I could say, if I made a drawing of a duck, I could say, okay, duck, I want you to move to the right for like 10 spots and then stop and then spin or whatever, right? And that as an entry point into coding, as opposed to just a blank screen where I have to type in code, was really important for me as a visual artist, because I couldn't make that leap to, like, okay, here's a blank screen, just start typing in code. That never worked for me, right? So I needed that bridge. So I wish Flash came back, because I don't know of a tool, that has that, except for, like, there's, like, programs for kids like Scratch and things like that. But that really helped.
Cool. Yeah, I think the same.
Totally agree. Great point.
Hey, can okay, you go.
Sure.
Thank you. My question actually was, since this is about like the history of crypto art, I was wondering if you did this presentation maybe like in a year or two, what would you think would be what we take out of what's going on at the moment, and maybe what do you think in the next, like, say 6 months to a year, what would you think would be emerging as like important things for the history of crypto art?
Cool question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because when it was such a small space, it was really easy to be a historian, because one person could actually keep track of everything that was going on, or a lot of the things that were going on anyway. So I feel like, the history I give, while it's not perfect, like, I leave out a lot of things that, like, hash masks and things like that other people think are really important or whatever. But for the most part, I could get my head around the first few years. But the space has become so big that it's kind of difficult to call out the trends while we're living in them. It's almost like in the early days, maybe the first 6 months of the web, it would be easy to call out websites that were really, unique and interesting. But 10 years into the web, there are so many sites, like, no one person can really even, like, capture them all in their head, if that makes sense. So, like, it's been harder for me this year, because NFTs are growing so fast. And if I had to sort of summarize, like, a year from now, like you asked, and look back at this year, it would almost be more about commercial accomplishments than artistic ones. And that happens when frenzies like this happen. The art can actually tend to suffer a little bit, and what we tend to see is more commercial progress. So I look at something like, Art Blocks is cool. I don't mean to say that the art's suffering on Art Blocks. I think Art Blocks is great, right? But it's really, Art Blocks is about sort of discovering a commercial economy for existing generative artists. So the accomplishment there this year is sort of progress on the selling side, or the market building side. And similarly, I think if I were to look back at this year, it would be these PFPs, the sort of profile pic mania. These, everybody trying to be the next CryptoPunks and doing like a 10,000 variation drop, right? Like, that feels pretty unique to this year. And some PFP projects are like super fascinating, and a lot of them just kind of feel like the same thing over and over again. But I feel like we're in a moment where those two things, sort of the commercialization of generative art and the and PFP mania are sort of the things that stand out for me this year, versus years prior, when I could pick an individual artist that seems to be steering the space. And I think that's somewhat natural when something gets as big as NFTs have gotten. It's harder for any one person to really stand out, and it's more about currents or movements that are more all-encompassing. So, yeah, hopefully that's not me dodging the question and is sort of still in the spirit of what you're asking. But I think it's more these big, broad movements that we're seeing versus any singular artwork or artist now.
We have a few other questions which I'm going to read out, unless you guys want to unmute. Stefano, if you want to, feel free. If not, I can read them out. I'll read it out. So, aside from Stefano asks, aside from Hen and ETH, how do you feel about other blockchains? With new chains being created, released every other day, should artists be careful where they mint and create their NFT? And thank you for the amazing presentation too.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I'm sort of the wrong person to ask on this. The reason I got in so early is because I'm not careful. I'm not a careful person by nature. I like things when they don't work and they're broken and we're not really sure if they're going to work and they're experimental and you try to find weird new ways to use clunky technology. Like, it's not an accident that I got into this space early. Everything was broken 4 years ago, so nobody wanted to touch it, right? But I find that thrilling. I love getting in on the early new stuff. It doesn't mean there's not risk. You have to go in with your eyes wide open. And, you know, when I was buying early NFTs, a lot of them disappeared and I lost money here and there. But I knew that was going to happen some of the time, and I was just tolerant of it. Yeah, there are people out there doing kind of scammy stuff, but I'm a big believer in a multi-chain future. I've been really lucky and blessed over the last month, 2 months, to spend a lot of time with Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber. So those are the guys that actually invented the blockchain. And so going back to 1991, a lot of people think Satoshi invented the blockchain. But if you read Satoshi's Bitcoin paper, 3 of the 7 references are actually to Scott and Stuart. And the fact, so they're big believers in a multi-chain future as well. And it's really helped change and shape the way that I look at things. We're so early that everyone focusing in on, say, just ETH or just Super Rare or just OpenSea would really be sad and a disservice to sort of the amount of experimentation and evolution that we should still be going through. That's another thing that I worry about as NFTs become popular, is that everything will sort of become the same and homogenous, when I really want to stay in this sort of broad experimental world. So yeah, I mean, do your own research, you know, as people always say, and don't spend more time or money than you can afford to lose on sort of the newer stuff. But I'd really encourage people to find the weird shit that's out on the fringe, and mess around with it and see what you can do with it. I think that's our job as artists in society. I think it comes to us sort of intuitively to take more risk, to try using things in ways they weren't intended, to be creative, right? So I hope folks try all the new stuff and invent more new stuff and try to break things and use things, you know, in different ways, because it'll get really boring. With every month that passes, the marketplaces all look more and more alike, and I don't want to end up in a spot where experimentation is sort of dead.
Do you have time for a couple more questions, or do you need to go, Jason?
Let me just check my calendar. Let's see. Yeah, I'm good. I can do another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, awesome. Go for it, Encapsulated.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a couple actually. One is kind of short. So we have this history of crypto art in general and NFTs, but I was also wondering, it would be very cool to have a history of generative art as well as part of the lectures somewhere, because I know a lot of artists, like the people from art blogs, like Alexis Andrea, are generative artists for a long time, and they all know a lot of things that a lot of people currently don't know. Like Fidenza, for example, is a known technique of drawing rectangles on a flow fields. It's nothing that is completely breakthrough. Tyler Hobbs has been exploring them for a while. So like Alex and that would be interesting too. And the other thing, which is more open question, how do we share all this knowledge with all the other NFT people around? Because I feel like the space is lacking a lot of education, and I would like to spread more of this knowledge. Do you have any suggestions on how we could do that?
Yeah, I'll answer your questions in reverse order. So I think the best way to spread the knowledge is to donate your time and energy to kind of pass along the information, right? It's why I'm here today, to talk to you guys. But my hope is that what I share with you, you'll share with others. I didn't learn all of this stuff on my own. It was people like Joe Looney and Bea from Data and Matt and John from CryptoPunks. They taught me what I know, and many other people. And that's why they were so generous with me. I feel obliged to share with you. And my hope is that you'll be generous with your time, just like I am now and they were with me. And if we keep spreading out exponentially that way, I think we can make a pretty big dent. So the other way to do it would be through writing and conferences and things like that, where we can get to larger audiences. I don't have as much time there right now, so I spent a lot of time early days writing about NFTs to try to help spread it. But I think if we all take some time and sort of donate that time to try to help educate others, to show that we're thankful for how people donated their time for us, then it's a good way for it to spread. And then your second question, which was actually, I guess, your first question, I think it would be a great idea to have sort of a generative art component to this. I think it was maybe less obvious 3 months ago during the first digital residency because it hadn't exploded in interest as much. But I know Georg Bach and I 3-4 years ago did what I think might be, it was small in a private gallery, but I think might be the most comprehensive generative art show ever, in that it went from early 1960s all the way up to the sort of AI GAN work, and included a lot of the early people from, actually Herbert Franke, I believe, is credited with coining the term generative art. It is in his 90s and actually showed up to the opening, and we had work from him. So my point is, there are folks like Georg and myself who would love to talk about it, but then there's a math component that you kind of hinted at, an algorithm component, that probably neither Georg or I would be really qualified to talk about. It would be fascinating to have someone like, I think Massimo Franchetti, I think is his name, who's more into the computer science side and could probably speak to some of these themes, visual themes that come up over and over again. And you're right, there are things like circle packing algorithms or things like that that have been around a long time that show up over and over in people's work. And if you're new to generative art, you'll see some of these things and be like, oh, wow, so-and-so invented this look. But, circle packing algorithms have been around forever, or the Penrose kind of stuff, right? Or I did a whole show called Game of Life around now I'm going to forget my own show what the core thing is, but there's an algorithm that people have used over and over again. So getting someone that sort of has that more tech background and can kind of get into the mathematical underpinnings and how those sort of relate to emergent behavior and stuff, it would be really, really rich. So yeah, it's something for Mikol to think about, but I agree with you. I'd love to participate or to attend that.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
I think, just a side note, like in terms of generative art specifically, there probably will be a bit, something might be coming for the residency itself. I'm speaking to KZ and the Art Blocks guys, and maybe there'll be like a dedicated resource for generative specifically, but let's see. Fingers crossed.
Cool.
Can I make a last question, Dano?
We have a few questions that have been written, so I just want to make sure that I ask them because they've been written a while ago.
Yeah, sure.
So one is from Latent Entropy, and he asks, can you comment on the market dynamics of different chains commanding different prices, i.e. ETH versus Tezos? Do you think this is something that will equalize over time or a feature that will be maintained?
Yeah, so it's sort of the way I collect. I could say one thing, but the real way to know what I think is to look at how I collect, right? So 90% of my money that I have set aside for collecting has gone to the Tezos and to Hic et Nunc this year, because I believe personally the art is more important to me than the chain. There's good arguments from other people that say, like, well, how do you know that chain or this chain is going to be around forever or this, that, and the other? But just fundamentally, I'm going for the art. And when art by great artists or great art by artists I've never even heard of is cropping up somewhere for 90% discount on one platform versus the other, that's where I'm going to go and where I'm going to spend my money. Now, does that mean I think that all the work on Tezos is going to go up and become worth a bunch of money? I have no idea. I don't really care, honestly. I'm buying the art because I love the art, because I'm really interested in the artists. And that's been my compass for the last 4 years. I certainly wasn't buying this art 4 years ago thinking it was going to make me rich, because nobody cared at all about it, right? So I've done very well. It's not to say that I don't care about money or that I haven't made money. I've done pretty good in this space, but it was never by trying to make money. I just collect art that I love, and regardless of the platform. And if I can get art by the same artist for much cheaper on Tezos or Hen than I can on, say, Art Blocks or an Ethereum-based platform, I'm going to go and buy it where I can afford it. Now, that's not like maybe the best financial advice. Who knows? I don't really know. Like I've done pretty well, even though that wasn't my goal. My goals weren't really financially driven. But just by buying art that I love, regardless of the platform or the marketplace, I've been very happy. And I guess a piece that I would add to that, that's sort of, that I often tweet over and over, sort of the same thing, is for collectors, I encourage them to always buy art that they love, by artists that they want to see succeed, for prices that they can afford, with the assumption that they'll never be able to sell that art again, right? So then if you can sell it or you decide to sell it, that's a bonus. But if you follow those rules, you're always going to have art in your collection that you really love, and you're never going to feel like you're stuck with something that you overpaid for because you weren't buying it to sell it, you were buying it because you love it. And when you look at life that way and collecting that way, the platform almost doesn't matter, in my opinion.
So we have time for one last question, which comes from Santiago, and it's about, and he asks, the Joe Looney's thing. So the asset that was pre-NFT that was minted before Kevin McCoy, like, do you know anything about it?
Yeah, so Joe's one of my best friends now, and is a contrarian. He's valuable for a lot of reasons in the space, but one of the reasons is because he always challenges everybody's thinking. And I think he looked at the Kevin McCoy sale through either Christie's or Sotheby's, and they essentially, according to Joe, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, reminted an entirely new token. And Joe's a believer because of the early days. Joe's more interested almost in the token than the art. The way Joe describes it, he says the token is the art, and the image is just what the token looks like, right? So the fact that they reminted the Kevin McCoy work to him it's almost like a forgery, because it's like, well, that's not the token that we're even talking about. It's a new token, right? So as part of that, Joe was going back and looking at his own personal experiments from those years and saying like, well, I've still got my tokens, and these predated. And I don't think I know Joe, so he's not the kind of guy where he's like, I want the attention, I was first. He's not really thinking of it that way. It's more about, well, you weren't necessarily first, Kevin, or you weren't necessarily first, somebody else. Like, I think he's just trying to suggest, like, let's not obsess over who is first. And if we're going to, like, look, I made stuff early too. Now, because I love Joe, and I think he's more important, or as important or more than anyone in the NFT history to the evolution of this space, I kind of drool over Thing and Seed, which are two of his earliest works. I think of them more as conceptual artworks. I think Seed does have an image associated with it, but a more traditional art collector probably has no interest in that. For me, I see him as sort of the center and core of the entire evolution of NFTs. So I kind of covet the idea that I could get one of those early works from him in my collection.
Okay, maybe one more, since it's 42, which comes from Richie, and he asks, where do you think programmable art will be going during the next months? I like the options async art gives to artists. Hopefully there will be more templates and programmable art will bloom. Are there any new marketplaces in development that you're keeping your eye on?
Yeah, so I look at programmable art and generative art, and some people call it software art, all as sort of in the same realm. Programmable art might be like slightly less code heavy, like, async makes it possible for artists that aren't necessarily coders to produce dynamic art, but it's not all that different conceptually from, say, like what Art Blocks does. Not to get like, too far out or hippy dippy, but my master's thesis from back 2007 to 2010 is really about how the walls between visual art and music and experience and sculpting and 2D art and all these things all start to collapse when you move into a digital realm, and I think these are almost artificial categorizations that this is visual art, this is music, or this is that. So, and I think we're going to see sort of a resurgence of multimedia and programmability of multimedia. NFTs obviously can go beyond art and serve purposes like, governance tokens or access tokens to experiences, or can become part of games. I think we're going to see a lot of these walls and distinctions collapse as creative people come in and intentionally sort of cross from one side to the other. And I think being able to program or having tools that let artists program at the contract level or at the NFT level are going to be key to seeing these new sort of experiences emerge. So I'm very, excited about the potential for that to move forward. I think Feral File, not super well known, Casey Visa's platform, is sort of a natural playground for that to happen. I think there's less pressure, at least at the moment, on Feral File to sell work for tons and tons of money, and people are actually go through and curate the show. So I'll be curating a show for them that comes out in January. And I think it fills this void of needing to slow things down a little bit in the NFT world, where everything's about how fast can you go and how much can you sell for. And Casey's obviously the godfather of software art and generative art. So I think it's not an accident that he's built a space where a lot of those experiments might emerge. I'm also really excited about the experiments that emerge on Hic-et-Nunc. I think Hic-et-Nunc still has a lot of that feeling of experimentation, and there are people sort of building things that sort of break Hic-et-Nunc or extend it, and projects that are hard to nail down exactly what they are. So yeah, I believe we're going to have sort of this super cool multimedia explosion where we move further and further away from the idea of art as being something that's just a static image, and we bring in, I know we have some writers on this call, so we bring in writers and musicians and painters, and the difference between those things starts to melt once we kind of bring them all to the level of ones and zeros, and they become sort of computational.
Absolutely. I really love Feral File, by the way. I think it's one of the platforms that I particularly enjoyed spending most time in, especially recently. So I pinned it for everybody as well to have a look. And I've also pinned Casey Reyes' Twitter as well. If you don't follow him, he's, first of all, a great artist and also a very nice human being too.
True.
Well, Jason, thank you so much. Thank you. It's always a pleasure, and it's super useful, I think, for me. I'm always learning new things, and for all of the artists as well. So really grateful for you to spend this time with us.
Yeah, thank you for everything that you do, Nicole, and for allowing me to talk to everybody. It's really an honor to get to know all these folks, and it's been fun to watch the artists from the first residency as they kind of enter into the community. Folks that want to reach out or ask me questions, I'm at Artnome on Twitter. I don't spend a lot of time on Discord, mostly on Twitter. Life's a little crazy right now. We moved to a new house and I'm launching a company, so I may not respond as quickly, but I do my best, so don't take it personal if I don't get back right away. And I don't always have my DMs open, so it's probably best to try to hit me up just publicly via Twitter, which will shame me into responding faster. And if you want, I'm happy to give out my email too. It's just jason@artnome.com. Again, I just ask that you're patient because I've got a lot going on and a fair amount of questions coming in, but really do like to help folks out as much as I can. So thanks for listening today and for the opportunity to get to know you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your
Thanks,
time.
everyone.
Yeah, take care.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.